Guys, thanks so much for pushing play. I'm very gratified to have on the line the one, the only Nomi Prins. She's a journalist, a writer, best-selling author of All the President's Bankers, which you should buy right now at Amazon.com. She also has the website nomiprins.com, where we're going to talk about her financial roadmap for 2016. And by the way, she used to work for Goldman Sachs, but now she's a truth teller. Nomi, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on, Sean.
Oh, it's such a thrill to have you back. You know, we talked about a year ago, and that's far too long because you are a truth teller, you are a researcher, and you're working on a new book, Artisans of Money, which we're going to talk about. First, I just wanted to ask you something real topical about your life. I saw in your roadmap for 2016 that you have a couple of dogs and you enjoy hiking. We have dogs too, and in a world as crazy as this one, it's nice to be able to just walk the dogs and clear your head, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And then my dogs keep me sane, and they're great hikers, and definitely being out with them just in nature in general when there's chaos around life or the markets is definitely a peaceful thing.
What kind of dogs do you have?
I have a Hungarian Vizsla and a Griffin. They're both basically big shaggy dogs. In fact, they're running around my feet right now, but you probably can't see them in the shot. They like to be part of everything.
Well, I'm going to have to Google those breeds now. That's getting back to what I was saying here about a world in chaos. Your financial roadmap for 2016, and guys, you can read that at nomiprins.com. The chaos we're seeing globally in the markets won't be an easy fix for central banks at this point. I think all of the easy fixes are gone. Why don't we just talk about your financial roadmap for 2016? Where would you like to start?
Sure. Well, I mean, on that, Sean, the idea of the central banks having propped up these markets and the largest private financial institutions operating in them for the last 7 years has been one of the reasons we've seen zero interest rates in the bigger countries or negative in Europe, and the quantitative easing that has purchased bonds. And so we've had public debt increasing relative to GDP, which on itself has effectively been decreasing if you take out some of the financial elements and jiggering of it. And we're getting to the end of what's possible in terms of stimulation. I would have thought the end should have happened years ago, but the reason it didn't was because of the epic coordinated efforts between the major central banks, in particular the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, to a lesser extent because the U.S. doesn't like to publicize it, but obviously the People's Bank of China is involved in latent coordinated efforts as well more recently. And that element has kept markets with the appearance of health that they haven't actually had because of true growth or true productivity or true expansion in labor forces or true wages going up anywhere in the world. And there's only so much you can do of that. The ECB had created a quantitative easing program last year that they announced would be until at first the summer of this year and then the fall of this year. Now they're talking about pushing it to 2017. These are desperate actions of trying to keep this artificial stimulation going as long as possible, not of changing track, but just to see what use can be taken out of it. And that is coming to an end. So that's why we're seeing much more turmoil in the beginning of this year in markets globally to the downside, with enhanced volatility that began last year as this transition away from central bank stimulation being the constant be-all, end-all to markets. And we're going to see more of that. So the roadmap, long answer to your question, really just looks at how that's going to manifest throughout the different areas in the world that I think are most important to be cognizant of going through this year.
Let me ask you about China. You write in your roadmap here, they say the behavior of the first day of the year is indicative of behavior in the year to come. If so, the first trading day does not bode well for the rest of the year. Turmoil began anew with Asian stock markets crumbling at the start of 2016. What do you make of what's going on in China? Can we believe anything the Chinese government says about its GDP and growth? And in fact, can we believe anything that the United States and the Federal Reserve says about growth? So I guess it's a two-part question. First, can we believe anything China is saying? The cancer is spreading. How important is China?
Well, the first part of looking at China is what you asked, which is, are the GDP numbers, are any figures reliable, whether they're coming from China, whether they're coming from the U.S., wherever they're coming from. And whether the actual figures are reliable or not, I don't think that GDP really presents the true picture of why markets operate today and why they crumble as fast as they do and why they've required the artificial stimulation that they've required to have remained at the levels that they got to in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008 globally. And of course, they are down from those levels at this moment. But GDP is easily manipulated. You know, you're talking about long lags in terms of presenting information. You're talking about cherry picking information. It doesn't take into account the real consumption power, the real inequality in wages or in incomes of populations relative to what's coming in from from the major companies in those countries or what the government is subsidizing in those countries from the standpoint of laws or the standpoint of extra stimulation through central banks. And so it really doesn't mean that much in terms of moving the markets. It gets used, it gets discussed when a number comes up, it gets dissected, and it has the effect of either moving a market up or down in a particular country or in what we have today in a much more codependent manner throughout countries and throughout markets. But what really matters is where capital moves and how quickly speculative capital moves in terms of reacting to numbers and just simply looking for opportunities on a short term basis, which is the other thing that we see often in markets, but we've seen in an accentuated way in the wake of this period of central bank stimulation and manipulation of markets. And so when capital flows out, which is what I believe is the biggest problem in the Chinese markets, it's not simply that their growth is slowing. That's sort of the marquee easy answer to the problems that China supposedly has, or the problems that China has that manifest in the rest of the world. It's more than that. It's the liquidity that dries up from having been in China because it thought that China was a good bet. What happened last year when the markets in China really took off and then subsequently really dove was that the Chinese decided to open their markets to more foreign speculative investment, to make it more easy for capital to come in, which is something that the U.S. and Europe have been big proponents of doing in markets throughout the world, and they did that. And then what happens when you open your market to enhanced and easy speculative money, it goes out just as fast, if not faster, as it comes in. So that's one of the other things we're seeing in China. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy as well as a growth story. And the self-fulfilling prophecy story is that capital goes in, capital comes out, more capital comes out. That's a classic behavior pattern of a stock market going down. So China is both of those things, and those things do manifest on the rest of the world and the rest of the world's markets.
Well, Nomi, I was reading an article just the other day. Over $1 trillion in capital has fled China over the past year, and now I'm looking at Zero Hedge, and the top 3 articles are all about China. My goodness, listen to this. Official in charge of China's cooked GDP books probed for, quote, severe violations. And Chinese lose faith in collapsing stock markets and currency, import most gold since 2013. And how about this one? Now, this one should mean a lot to you. Coming from Goldman Sachs, you could give us some inside baseball on this headline. China warns Soros against starting a currency war. Quote, you cannot possibly succeed, end quote. Soros's war on the renminbi and the Hong Kong dollar cannot possibly succeed. About this, there can be no doubt, they say. It seems like global monetary warfare is reaching a fevered pitch. What do you make of Soros threatening the renminbi? What do you make of monetary warfare? How bad is this going to get?
Well, yeah, first of all, it just dovetails on what we were just saying, that GDP is one element. Yes, it can be manipulated. The other element is capital flows going more quickly out of a market than they came in, which both of those 2 articles, the first 2 articles on Zero Hedge, probe into in greater depth. And also Soros sort of being warned not to attack or wanting to attack the currency there is kind of reminiscent of what happened when Soros attacked the British pound. That didn't really work out so well for the pound. But what it shows is that regardless of the economy, and China certainly is the world's first or second largest economy, depending on what month we're looking at, which is why, again, those figures between the U.S. and China can be a little bit circumspect here and there. But that aside, it is easy to take currency hits and market hits on any country. because of the extent to which capital is so loose, speculation is so easy, money is so cheap because of what the Federal Reserve and ECB began and continue to do in terms of the cost of money to the largest players in those markets. And so we have a situation now where anything is in play, regardless of what the real fundamentals may or may not be in a country. And China is the biggest current representative of all of those three things coming together that you mentioned in those articles that Zero Hedge has up today. And usually when that sort of gauntlet has been put down, a currency will weaken. What the Chinese central bank has done is already devalue its currency, not because of the reasons that Trump says to sort of be mean to the United States and all that kind of thing, but also because of market forces and its own internal pressures and preservation. You know, if every country wants to preserve itself first, a central bank will do that with its reserves. Government will try to do that with regulatory policy, usually way after the fact of it being useful. And that's what we're seeing with China now. And we're seeing, therefore, we will see a knock-on effect throughout the world because of this capital moving out of China, or because of currencies being, the currency in China or in the rest of Asia being attacked by speculators, whether that's Soros or whether that's other hedge funds that piggyback on him, as other hedge funds tend to piggyback on each other all the time when taking out these sorts of hits. So what used to be a devaluation and sort of a move to zero interest rates or low interest rates from simply the central banks has just been transformed into them fueling these hits through other financial institutions and funds.
Well, let's talk about the dollar and gold in the Federal Reserve. The Fed recently raised rates, 25 basis points, and now it's clear that the global economy is an absolute basket case. I think it's becoming evident, too, that the U.S. economy, despite what the Federal Reserve says, despite what the Mockingbird mainstream media says, the U.S. economy is also a basket case. And I think things are falling apart now even more quickly than those of us in the truth media would like to see, because I don't want to see this paradigm fall apart to the point where there's rioting in the streets, where the entire system collapses overnight. And you write in your piece here, the fact that much of the world is careening toward global depression will keep the dollar higher than it deserves to be. No truer words have ever been spoken. The dollar does not deserve to have the strength it has, but yet it is strong. It's the currency, I guess, of last resort, the best of the worst. Why don't we talk about the Federal Reserve, the dollar, and gold? What do you see happening this year to the dollar, and do you see massive inflation or hyperinflation ever happening to the dollar?
Well, I think, as I said in the roadmap, the dollar doesn't deserve to be as strong as it is, but I think it will continue to remain strong because this is a year where economies that have already started to deteriorate, or even saw signs of improving and then sort of had gone back into deterioration mode, are really just going to continue to do that. Because at the point at which money is at zero or negative, growth turns negative. And there is inflation in certain countries like Brazil. There is increased joblessness going on throughout the world, regardless of what headline job figures do say, and certainly in the youth forces. And there are problems now because of zero interest rates throughout the world in paying pension liabilities, which had been accumulated with the anticipation of having more interest come into them to be able to pay off pensioners throughout the world. There's major problems with cash flow going on that none of the remedies, not that they were remedies for these problems, but the remedies to the private banking system and the global market system that the Federal Reserve had led and is still leading, have been able to take into account, have been able to solve. So that stuff is still in the system and getting worse. And then the dollar maintains its strength in the process because of the fact that everything else is getting worse, not because the policy of zero interest rates should ever have been good for anybody's currency. But the reason it was, and the reason the dollar stayed strong, was because of the relative weakness of everywhere else, and also the fact that the Federal Reserve was perceived to be moving in a strong and sort of positive manner to fix the global markets and the global economies, as it said. And somehow this idea of strength also came into a dollar, even though rates were going down, which should indicate the dollar should have gone down. I just think the dollar is therefore going to remain strong. And with gold, what we saw last year was, though gold, because the dollar was so strong, decreased in value relative to the dollar, relative to other currencies, it didn't necessarily increase. In fact, it held its value to a lot of the other currencies, which just shows that the correlation, the relationship between the dollar and gold, or the negative relationship between the dollar and gold as priced in dollars, is continuing. And I think that will also continue. But if you buy gold in other currencies that are themselves deteriorating to the dollar, then that's a way to preserve wealth in those currencies, as well as to sort of leg into a portion of gold as that preservation of value, which is what central banks outside of the Federal Reserve have been doing globally for that very reason.
Okay, and let me ask you about oil. The plummeting price of oil is clearly causing many problems geopolitically for nations like Saudi Arabia, Russia. What do you make of the price of oil being below, say, $30 a barrel? Is this sustainable? And at what point does the price of oil turn around? The Baltic Dry Index would suggest that the price of oil has fallen organically because demand worldwide has slowed, and in fact, global economic activity has slowed to a crawl. So where do we stand with oil, and is $30 oil sustainable?
If we look at different countries where the extraction and refining cost of oil, collectively might indicate they could handle $20 a barrel, for example, in the OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia, and Iran now being able to come on board with sanctions being lifted, having been lifted there, they do have the ability, even though it hurts the bottom line of their country, to continue to produce oil effectively at a lower level than 30, which is why we've had this sort of volatility around 30, between sort of 33 and 28 over the last several months, several weeks, having had oil, of course, go on quite a downfall throughout last year. So I think there's still downside in oil. Is it going to get to $10 a barrel? No, likely not. At some point, it just doesn't make sense. But there's a sort of volatile interval, I think, around $30 that we've been seeing, which is about supply and demand. It's about where speculative plays are positioned, and they had been quite short. They remain sort of short, so there is downside from the standpoint of just sheer financial pressure, aside from supply and demand issues. And there is the question of what happens between Saudi Arabia and Iran, of course, going forward. Today there was a mention that the OPEC countries might decide to sort of hold it back if they think that the other countries will also hold back. I mean, there's those kinds of conversations are going to continue to pop up, and they're going to create some volatility in the price of oil. But until there is real growth, and also the speculators sort of get on board with that growth, because again, like with China, like with GDP in the stock market, nothing's just about the economic parameters anymore. Everything is about economic parameters, perception, and where speculative trading and capital flows can move things on any given moment. So we have to be cognizant of all of that. And so I think there is downside of oil in the near future because of all of that. And I think probably it needs to be watched very closely to see if that changes. And if that changes, yes, of course, prices could go up. But I don't think that's happening, again, in the very near term.
Well, can we talk a little bit about your new book, Artisans of Money? We constantly point our fingers here at SGT Report at the central banks of the world, those that founded the central bank, the Federal Reserve here in the United States, and those that control central banks around the planet seem to me, in my estimation, Nomi, to be the enemies of humanity. You're going to be traveling around the world, and I think you've already embarked on those journeys to go to these nations and talk to people about their currencies, about central banking, to see firsthand how central banking and the manipulation of money affects people. And, you mentioned Argentina, Brazil. We know what happened in Zimbabwe. We know what happened in the Weimar Republic. I think it's coming here to our shores at some point. Tell us about your new book, and why did you call it Artisans of Money?
Well, I am working on it now. This is kind of my, this will be what I'm doing for this year in terms of going to countries, of researching the internal conversations and documents and what was said to the public versus what actually transpired from the main central banks, as well as the more periphery central banks, which, something like Brazil, which, has a very strong history of being independent, yet on the other hand has codependencies with the United States, and has had to balance what was right for the country with what was required of them by the United States, by the Federal Reserve, by the IMF, by to a lesser extent the ECB. So I'm looking at all of those relationships and what really transpired with on the ground, as well as relative to other countries, plus how, yes, that it impacts the economies and individuals and small businesses and so forth in the major and more peripheral countries. Because what has happened, particularly since the financial crisis, and it's not like these central banks just emerged, in the last 8 years, 7, 8 years, but what has happened in this period of time is very different. What has happened is that they have collectively, some more than others, the core ones more than others, redefined what a market system is. They've taken away the very even unrealistic notion of completely free markets that were actually just indicators of movers in those markets and not manipulated at all, which of course they were. But they've added to that this sense that markets are supported by an external force that has nothing to do with real economies. It has nothing to do with production. It has nothing to do with research and development. It has nothing to do with actual people. It has everything to do with sustaining the larger banks and the larger financial players in any of the larger countries, and providing markets the boost that they need, the artificial injection that they need, whether it's by zero interest rates, whether it's by quantitative easing, whether that's by, underhanded currency swap agreements where one central bank gives some money in a swap form to another central bank so they can make their currency look better or worse, and all of these different manipulations. And that goes back to why I call the book Artisans of Money. Actually, my agent picked that title. He's very good with titles, because we were just talking about this idea of artificial fabrication, this sort of epic new period that we're in, where all this is possible and legal and unnatural. And what is it really? It's really about an artisanal form of money. It's a new fabricated to the moment, to the perceived requirement money by these central banks. So whereas my old book, or the other work that I've done, has been largely centered around what governments and private banks and companies have done together for themselves, and in many cases on a negative, with a negative impact to economies and real populations. This is looking at that additional player of central banks and how they really come into a massive power position that, though they were always powerful, is significantly greater than it has been before in altering, just the foundation of finance and economics globally.
Yeah, it's a great title. And I was wondering, did you get a chance to see the Michael Lewis book turned into a movie called The Big Short?
I haven't seen it yet, no.
Oh, you should check it out. I think you'll enjoy it. Of course, you probably read the book, but what happened in 2008 never got fixed. In fact, things have only gotten worse. The criminality on Wall Street, the speculation, the money bubble, the debt bubble, everything seems to have inflated and only gotten worse. So let me ask you this, Nomi, before we let you go. Do you see any possible happy ending to any of this? Is there any way that this global Ponzi scheme can have a happy ending for the common man? Or is that just ridiculous? Are we going to end up in the same basket as Brazil and Argentina and Zimbabwe? I mean, is there any way at all we can extricate ourselves from this situation? And is there anything you'd recommend the common man do to try to protect himself?
Well, that's a good word, extricating, because that's really what I would recommend, and I've recommended taking cash out of the markets, out of banks, using it for real assets, using it for real things that people need, saving it in a form that doesn't get negative interest rates, because when you put it in a bank, not only do you not get any money for it, but you're also paying a fee, so you're technically on negative interest rates, which should not be how a common person is dealing with their finances, or allowing their money to be used by banks for purposes that have nothing to do with helping them. So I do think cash is important. I do think sort of staying out of the fray in that respect is important, as is investing in hard assets, and also investing in each other's businesses. I do think that the hope here, because the top part of the system is so messed up, and is so subsidized by the Federal Reserve and central banks and private banks, and the relationships with what government policy does or doesn't do to allow all this to happen, that the way out for any country, for people anywhere, is to really try to exist as much as possible financially out of that system. And what that means is it means supporting local businesses. It means potentially getting loans from some of the sort of outside lenders, or Kickstarter. But I mean, just something that can actually help on an external from the main fray basis. And I think that helps. First of all, it helps one have a sense of financial autonomy, because at the end of the day, you're still living in this system, but you can try to extract or extricate yourself from parts of it. You cannot be involved in the big banks, or if you are, you can find the ones that will give you the best terms. You can pay down debt with some of the cash you take out, so you're not subsidizing them while they're getting 0% interest rates and charging you 18 or 19 or 25. So I think the more that we take our finances back, even if it's only 10% of what we have and what we do, and we all do that, we all help each other's businesses in our local communities or in our states or in our regions. I think the more we can at least turn some stuff around from the ground up, because it's not going to come from the top down.
Yeah, I like that. It definitely is not going to come from the top down, and I don't think the 2016 elections are going to save us. I don't think there will be a sea change in 2016. Certainly not if Hillary Clinton gets in. My Lord, the woman should be in prison. What do you make of Donald Trump?
Well, I've just got a piece that'll come out, I think, next week on the whole sort of billionaires parade of all of this. And of course, Trump is a billionaire. We know that. That's not shocking. I don't really see how Donald Trump, if he becomes a nominee or even becomes a president, is going to do much. And this is the important thing that we should look at when electing a president, to really fix any of these issues. He doesn't really talk about any of these issues. He's a very sort of infantile approach to talking about how China's just trying to bash us or Mexico's just trying to steal our jobs. I mean, he talks at a level that doesn't indicate a core desire to really do anything but sort of pander to that constituency, but also it doesn't create a core desire to really fix things or really look at what's actually wrong. So, yeah, that won't really. But I don't think Hillary Clinton, as you mentioned, would do that either. Hillary knows where her money has come from and will come from, and what she needs to do to preserve that. And so I don't really think that there would honestly be much of a difference if either one of those two were president. They would just, one person raises money from billionaires, one person is a billionaire. I mean, it's at the end of the day, if you take away political rhetoric and you look at what would actually happen, I don't think it's that different.
Right. Well, the one thing I'd say for Donald Trump is that at least he'll speak up for the First and Second Amendment, whereas Hillary would love to grab the guns. But I wanted to ask you this before we let you go. Hillary was paid $675,000 for 3 speeches to Goldman Sachs. In having once worked at Goldman Sachs, I just wanted to get your take on that. $225,000 a speech. That's a pretty handsome prize, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean that's her going rate. What's interesting is that she's been doing that in the process, in the interim period of being Secretary of State and wanting to run for president. And so when you have that kind of money being on offer for your speeches and the requirement that the desire for your presence, that's where Bernie Sanders and others have mentioned this, but he did at the last debate. It's really hard to imagine you'd be distinguishing where your money's coming from with what kind of policies you would be enacting. And actually, the other stat that's in this piece that is that not only did she get that money from Goldman, but she made about $3 million, I think, in speaking gigs over the course from various financial, corporate, and other institutions. So that's just one portion of it.
That's right. In fact, I read that she and Bill had made $125 million since leaving the White House for speeches. I've called it legalized bribery, but I guess we'd have to get the transcripts and see what she said to Goldman Sachs to really call it legalized bribery. But wouldn't it be fun to get the transcripts?
Sure she didn't yell at them.
Pardon?
I'm sure she didn't yell at them. I mean, I'm sure that, first of all, I'm sure it was all very proprietary, and maybe she said something in that sort of jokey way that might indicate that she kind of is in on it. But I would doubt that she sat there and said, what you guys should do? You should really, about that fine, that $5 billion fine or that you just had, or any of the stuff you did during the mortgage fraud years, or any of the other stuff you're doing. I'm going to come in and make sure that's all illegal, and you're all going to get punished for it. I doubt that was the tenor of the speeches. I wasn't invited to them, but I would doubt it.
Yeah, you weren't invited. I wasn't invited. You should have been invited as a Goldman alum. Well, yeah. You know what? It's probably a little bit like the FBI threatening to crack down and indict Hillary. I don't think we'll see that. I don't think that's any more likely than Hillary becoming president and cracking down on Goldman Sachs, unfortunately. But that's really the definition of fascism, the revolving door between these corporations and the politicians. And it's just a sad state. We're in a sad state state. And I think it makes it very difficult. I think it makes it really technically impossible for us to extricate ourselves from this central banking Ponzi scheme that's been created and is being perpetuated with easy money. The Fed's out of bullets. So this is going to come down. The House of Cards, I think, is in the process of coming down. And it's scary. It's scary, but it's really helpful to have people like you, intellectuals like you out there, Nomi, trying to break things down for us, inform the public, and write these fantastic books. Guys, you can buy All the President's Bankers over at Amazon, and we look forward to Artisans of Money. I want to thank you very much for your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And again, your audience is great. I kudos to you for connecting in with that.
Well, I thank you very much for joining us. And guys, I want to thank you so much for your support. Thanks for checking us out at sgtreport.com and thelibertymill.com. Real news 24/7. Have a great week.